Okay, we've talked about the founding of the 13 colonies, the conflicts that colonists had with Native Americans, and the Atlantic trade system. So now we need to briefly mention the relationship that colonies had with England, or more specifically, British Parliament. Already in the mid to late 1600s, we can find differences brewing between colonists and the British government. Between 1651 and 1673, Parliament passed what are called the Navigation Acts, which were based on the concept of mercantilism. But what is mercantilism? Well, imagine that all of the resources of the world, all of the natural resources, could fit into, say, this pie. Mercantilism is the theory that that's all there is. Those are all the resources in the world. So it's a constant competition between other nations to figure out how much of that pie your country is going to get. So Europeans saw the world outside of Europe as a land of vast resources, but only a certain number of resources. There was a finite amount that they had to compete for in order to be the dominant economic power. So in Britain, Parliament responded to this theory with the Navigation Acts. These acts established three basic rules. First, only English or colonial merchants and ships were allowed to trade in the colonies. That meant that French, Spanish, Dutch, or any other traders weren't even welcome in the English colonies. Second, certain valuable American resources could only be sold in England or in other English colonies. So these resources included wool, sugar, tobacco, indigo, and later rice, furs, and copper. So a lot of the most profitable items were not available to sell outside of England or the English colonies. Third, anything being shipped to the colonies had to go through England, where the traders would have to pay British taxes before moving on to America. Britain had to take their cut before anything could get shipped out. These acts had the effect of limiting American trade in colonies like Virginia, where many of these major crops were grown. On the other hand, New England shipbuilders significantly benefited from these laws, since all the trade ships in the colonies had to be English. Still, enforcement of the Navigation Acts was difficult. The American coast had many harbors that were open to smugglers, and the colonial courts tended to side with the local smugglers over the customs officials that were sent to get the tax money. In response to this problem, Parliament established several courts of their own, which were specifically designed to prosecute violations of the Navigation Acts. This increased control over the colonies continued when King James II ascended to the throne. James united New York, New Jersey, and all of New England into a single royal province called the Dominion of New England. In doing this, James abolished the colonial legislatures and limited town hall meetings. He appointed Sir Edmund Andros as governor of the Dominion, who was able to make laws, levy taxes, and create courts almost completely on his own. The colonists endured Andros's rule for 2 years. They weren't happy about it, but they dealt with it, until New Englanders learned that King James's rule was coming to an end. James had made enemies by creating new taxes without consulting Parliament and converting to Catholicism. In what became known as the Glorious Revolution, James was replaced on the throne in 1688 by his daughter Mary and her husband, the Dutch Prince William of Orange. In the colonies, Boston's leaders jailed Andros and his associates, while in Maryland, Protestants overturned the government of the Catholic leaders, and New Yorkers overthrew the pro-James government there. The colonists saw their actions as supporting William and Mary. Unfortunately, those new monarchs believed, like James had, that the colonies needed a little bit more direction from the crown and parliament, so more structure as opposed to what they were used to before James. So, although local government systems were reinstated, there was more control from England in most of the colonies. Following the Glorious Revolution, England began a war with France on account of the fact that King Louis XIV of France had allied himself with James II after he had been removed from power. The war was known in the colonies as King William's War. Colonists made attempts to attack the French colonies in Quebec and Montreal, despite the fact that Native Americans were still attacking New England towns during the late 1680s. These expeditions to the French territories failed miserably. The New England colonists spent the rest of the war on the defensive, and even after the war in Europe ended in 1697, Maine could still not be resettled because of continued fighting in the region, which lasted for decades.